The room was steeped in an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional scrape of Sherlock Holmes's violin bow as it hovered indecisively over the strings. The fire in the hearth flickered feebly, casting jagged shadows on the walls of 221B Baker Street. Holmes sat slumped in his chair, his sharp features softened by an uncharacteristic pallor. His piercing gray eyes, now dulled with disinterest, stared at the ceiling as though willing some intellectual salvation to manifest there. Dr. Watson, seated opposite him, watched his friend with growing concern. It had been weeks since their last case, and Holmes, deprived of mental stimulation, had succumbed to a lethargy that bordered on despair. "Holmes," Watson ventured gently, "you cannot go on like this. Your mind is a blade that dulls without use. Surely London has not run dry of puzzles worthy of your talents." Holmes stirred, his voice low and listless. "Puzzles, Watson, abound. But they are trifles, trivialities. What I crave is the singular case, the challenge that can truly occupy the intellect. Until then—" He trailed off, his hand drifting to the violin again. Watson leaned forward, his tone firm yet imploring. "Then seek it, Holmes. Do not wait for the world to deliver its mysteries to your doorstep. There are countless souls in need of help. Surely among them lies the challenge you seek." Holmes smirked faintly, though it carried no warmth. "Your faith in humanity's capacity for intrigue is touching, my dear Watson. But the riddle I seek eludes me still." Watson stood, pacing the room. "You cannot languish here. What good is your mind if you allow it to waste away?" Holmes raised a hand to silence him, but before he could reply there came a knock at the door, urgent, rapid, and insistent. Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway, her usual composure tinged with unease. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. She insists it is of utmost importance." Holmes straightened slightly, curiosity flickering in his eyes for the first time in days. "Show her in." A moment later, Lady Eleanor Ashcroft swept into the room. Her regal bearing was undermined by the tremor in her hands and the shadows beneath her eyes. Watson, ever observant, noted the pristine lace gloves she wore, marred only by faint stains at the fingertips. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. "My name is Lady Eleanor Ashcroft, and I am in desperate need of your assistance." Holmes gestured for her to sit, his posture now taut with attention. "Pray, proceed, Lady Ashcroft. Time is often an enemy in matters of distress." She took a deep breath, clasping her hands tightly. "It is my brother, Lord Charles. He was a diplomat. 3 days ago, he vanished without a trace. I fear something terrible has happened." Lady Eleanor reached into her handbag and produced a slip of paper, its edges frayed. She handed it to Holmes, who examined it with keen intensity. "This was found in his study," she explained. "It was the only clue we could uncover." Holmes held the note aloft, its contents stark against the parchment. A smear of blood stained the corner, and scrawled across the paper was a cipher, its characters angular and erratic. Watson peered over Holmes's shoulder. "A cipher? What do you make of it, Holmes?" Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "It is not the cipher itself that intrigues me, but the circumstances of its presence. Blood and a code, hardly the tools of a diplomat. There is something deeper here." Holmes's fingers traced the edges of the note, his expression unreadable. Watson observed the faint flicker of something unspoken in his friend's eyes. A shadow of recognition, perhaps, or of dread. "You seem disturbed, Holmes," Watson ventured cautiously. Holmes's gaze snapped to Watson, sharp and unyielding. "Disturbed, Watson, but not deterred. This cipher is a gateway to something far larger. A network, perhaps, or a vendetta. Either way, it carries echoes of certain past entanglements." Watson tilted his head, sensing the weight of Holmes's words. "Do you mean to say this case is personal?" Holmes did not reply immediately. Instead, he placed the note on the table with deliberate care. "We shall see," he said at last, though his tone betrayed more than a hint of foreboding. Lady Eleanor's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Holmes, I implore you, find my brother. Unravel this nightmare." Holmes rose, the vigor of the purpose returning to his frame. "Rest assured, Lady Ashcroft, that I shall devote every faculty to uncovering the truth. Watson, prepare yourself. We have work to do." Watson nodded, his heart lifted by the sight of Holmes invigorated once more. "Where shall we begin?" Holmes retrieved his coat and hat, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "At the scene of the disappearance, naturally. But first, Lady Ashcroft, I must ask, has your brother ever mentioned the name Moriarty?" Lady Eleanor's eyes widened in alarm, but before she could answer, Holmes was already halfway to the door. Holmes's steely gaze swept over the notes and personal correspondences strewn across the diplomat's desk. Each piece was a fragment of a larger puzzle. Watson sat nearby, his notebook at the ready, documenting Holmes's observations with a mix of awe and duty. "Lord Charles," Holmes began, his tone clipped and analytical, "was a man deeply enmeshed in the world of diplomacy. Yet his alliances, I suspect, extended beyond the official." He tapped a letter with his index finger, its contents cryptic yet suggestive of clandestine dealings. Watson frowned. "You mean to imply he was involved in something unsanctioned?" "Precisely. Observe the language here. A veiled urgency in this letter from an unnamed correspondent. And this, Watson," Holmes gestured toward a photograph of Lord Charles with a man whose face had been hastily scratched out, "speaks of personal enmity. Such defacement is rarely idle." "Family disputes?" Watson ventured. "Unlikely. This bears the mark of professional vengeance. His personal ties, however, may yet reveal a motive. We shall speak to his housekeeper shortly. She will have her own insights." The diplomat's residence was eerily quiet, the air tinged with an acrid hint of burnt paper. Holmes's sharp eyes roamed the study, taking in the overturned chair, a shattered ink bottle staining the rug, and scratches on the floorboards near the desk. "Watson, note the alignment of these marks," Holmes instructed, crouching beside the desk. "They suggest a struggle, swift yet decisive." Watson scanned the room. Yet no sign of forced entry. Whoever did this was either known to him or had access. "Precisely," Holmes said. "And this scent of char, it is deliberate. Someone sought to destroy evidence." He plucked a charred scrap from the fireplace. "But, as always, they left behind more than they intended." Holmes's fingers glided over the edges of the desk, pausing at an imperfection beneath the left drawer. "Watson, observe!" he exclaimed, pressing a concealed latch. With a faint click, a hidden compartment slid open, revealing a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth. "What have we here?" Watson muttered as Holmes carefully unwrapped the package. The contents were damning. Letters marked with official seals, maps of foreign embassies, and a list of names, some underlined ominously in red ink. "These," Holmes declared, "are no ordinary documents. They are state secrets, evidence of dealings with powers who would see Britain undone. Lord Charles was either a participant or a victim of espionage." Watson looked grim. "This is treason." "Or a trap," Holmes corrected. "But the answer lies in these papers." Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the documents across the table, his brow furrowed in concentration. Among the items was a cipher, its symbols etched with meticulous precision. "This," Holmes mused, "is no simple substitution. It is a layered encryption, designed by someone with a deep understanding of cryptography." Watson observed silently as Holmes worked, his pencil darting across the page with furious speed. After several tense minutes, Holmes sat back, his face alight with revelation. "It points to a name," he said finally. "The Red Thorn, a clandestine organization rumored to deal in espionage and assassination." Watson's eyes widened. And you believe Lord Charles was involved? Not willingly, perhaps, but his fate and this network are intertwined. Holmes's voice carried a gravity Watson rarely heard. Holmes tapped the decoded cipher with a finger, his expression uncharacteristically somber. The red thorn has roots that run deep, Watson. Deeper than I had anticipated. Watson, sensing his friend's unease, asked, "Holmes, do you recognize something in these papers? Something from your past?" Holmes hesitated, an unusual flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. "Yes, Watson. The methods, the precision. It echoes an adversary I had thought long buried. Moriarty's shadow looms once more, though indirectly." Watson stiffened. "You're saying the red thorn is tied to Moriarty's network? His legacy, at the very least. This case is no longer merely about Lord Charles. It is a battle against a conspiracy that could destabilize the very fabric of our nation." Holmes's voice grew colder, more resolute. "And Watson, we must tread carefully. They will not hesitate to kill again." The room fell silent as Watson absorbed the weight of Holmes's words. The case had grown far darker than either had anticipated, and its implications were more personal than Watson dared to imagine. Holmes rose abruptly, his resolve sharpened. "Prepare yourself, Watson. Our next move will determine whether we uncover the truth or fall victim to it." The clamor of distant voices filled the air as Holmes and Watson stepped into the dimly lit tavern. The scent of stale ale mingled with the acrid tang of pipe smoke, making the atmosphere almost stifling. At a corner table sat their quarry, a wiry man with darting eyes and a nervous twitch in his fingers. "Mr. Carlyle, I presume?" Holmes addressed the man with a tone that was polite yet edged with authority. The informant looked up sharply, his gaze flicking between the two men. "You're the one they call Holmes," he murmured, his voice low and strained. "Correct, and you are in possession of information I require." Holmes's eyes locked onto Carlyle's with a precision that made the man squirm. "I don't. It's dangerous to talk about the red thorn." Carlyle glanced around, his movements jittery. Holmes leaned forward. "More dangerous than crossing me? Speak quickly, sir, for time is a luxury we do not possess." Carlyle hesitated, his lips parting to speak, but his words were swallowed by a sudden crack. A gunshot, sharp and deafening. The informant lurched forward, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. Watson sprang to his side, pressing a handkerchief against the wound in a futile attempt to stem the bleeding. "Holmes," Watson called urgently. "He's fading fast." Holmes crouched beside them, his expression grim. "Carlyle, you must tell me. Who did this? What does the red thorn seek?" The dying man's eyes fluttered open, his breaths shallow and labored. "Beware. The thorn. That cuts the heart," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Then, with a final shuddering gasp, his body went limp. Holmes rose, his jaw clenched. His gaze darted toward the window, where a shadow moved just out of sight. "Watson, the assassin may still be near. Remain vigilant." But the shadow had vanished, leaving behind only the echo of Carlyle's cryptic warning and the growing weight of unanswered questions. Back in the relative safety of their carriage, Watson studied Holmes. The detective's usual composure had given way to a taut silence, his hands gripping his cane so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Holmes," Watson ventured carefully, "are you well?" Holmes did not immediately respond, his gaze fixed on the passing streets. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but sharp. "Watson, do you recall the phrase, 'a thorn in one's side'?" "Of course," Watson replied. "The red thorn is no mere inconvenience. It is a dagger aimed at the very heart of this nation." Holmes exhaled sharply, his usual confidence edged with unease. "And Carlyle's death was no coincidence. He was silenced to keep us blind. Someone is watching, Watson. Watching us." Watson frowned, unnerved by the rare glimpse of vulnerability in his friend. "We'll unravel this together, Holmes. We always do." Holmes met Watson's gaze briefly but said nothing. The air in Baker Street was thick with tension as Holmes meticulously examined the cipher found among Carlyle's belongings. Symbols and numbers danced across the page, a labyrinth of secrecy. "Watson, note the recurring pattern here," Holmes said, tapping the paper with his pencil. "It suggests a substitution code, but the key is hidden within Carlyle's final words." "The thorn that cuts the heart," Watson murmured. "But what does it mean?" Holmes worked in silence, his pencil darting across the page in rapid strokes. Finally, he leaned back, his expression one of grim triumph. "It points to a location, a townhouse on Blackthorn Lane. A name that aligns disturbingly well with our adversaries," Watson noted. "Indeed, and the odds are high that this address is no mere coincidence." Holmes's voice carried a steely resolve. "We must act swiftly, for every moment lost is an opportunity gained by the Red Thorn." Holmes donned his coat and hat, his movements brisk and determined. Watson rose as well, preparing to follow, but Holmes stopped him with a raised hand. "Watson, I must insist you remain here," Holmes said firmly. "Holmes, you cannot mean to go alone," Watson protested. "This organization is dangerous. You'll need backup." Holmes shook his head. "This is no ordinary investigation, Watson. The Red Thorn's methods are ruthless, and their reach is vast. If something were to happen to me, you must be here to continue the fight." "Holmes," Watson began, his tone heavy with emotion. "I've never abandoned you before, and I do not intend to start now. This is not abandonment, Watson. It is strategy. Trust me on this." Holmes's voice softened, though his resolve did not waver. Watson clenched his fists, torn between duty and loyalty. "Then promise me one thing, Holmes. Promise you'll return." Holmes hesitated, his expression unreadable. "I shall endeavor to do so," he said at last. Then, without another word, he slipped into the night, leaving Watson behind with a heart heavy with foreboding. The evening air was laden with dampness as Holmes, clad in the rough attire of a dock worker, approached the decrepit warehouse on the Thames. Inside, the faint murmur of voices reached his ears, the tones clipped and deliberate. Holmes slipped into the shadows, his movements precise and soundless. Positioned behind a stack of crates, he took in the scene. A semicircle of men, their faces obscured by hoods, and at their center, a figure with an air of command. The leader spoke with chilling certainty, his voice carrying a weight that demanded attention. Holmes adjusted his position, careful to remain unseen. His heart raced, though not with fear. It was the thrill of the hunt, the perilous balance between discovery and revelation. As he strained to catch every word, he allowed himself a fleeting thought. The risk of exposure here was immense. Yet, if his suspicions about the Red Thorn were correct, the knowledge gained tonight could unravel a conspiracy of catastrophic proportions. Holmes's sharp ears caught the leader's next words, each one a hammer blow to the stability of the British Empire. "The assassination of the Foreign Secretary will be the signal," the man declared. "Once the others follow, chaos will reign, and the path to control will be clear." The gathered men nodded in agreement, their murmurs of assent a grim chorus. Holmes's mind worked furiously, piecing together the implications of the plan. This was no mere gang. It was a network of operatives with the power to destabilize governments. One of the men raised a question. "And the matter of the detective? This Sherlock Holmes, he's meddled before." The leader's voice grew sharper. "Holmes is but a man. If he becomes a thorn in our side, he will be dealt with as others have been." A surge of anger coursed through Holmes, though he remained outwardly composed. To hear his name invoked so casually in such sinister terms was both a confirmation of his pursuit and a harbinger of the danger he now faced. As the meeting began to adjourn, Holmes shifted slightly to reposition himself. but a faint creak of wood betrayed his presence. The leader's head snapped toward the source of the sound, his eyes narrowing. "Who's there?" he demanded. Holmes froze, every muscle tense, but the men were already moving, their boots echoing ominously on the floorboards. Within moments, Holmes's hiding spot was exposed. "There!" one of them shouted. Holmes bolted, his mind racing as he calculated his escape. He darted through the maze of crates, the shouts of his pursuers growing louder. A bullet whizzed past his shoulder, the sharp crack of gunfire reverberating through the warehouse. A door loomed ahead, barely ajar. Holmes reached it, his hand slick with sweat, and threw it open. He stumbled into the night, his breath ragged. But his reprieve was short-lived. A sharp pain erupted in his side as a second shot found its mark. He pressed a hand to the wound, his vision swimming. Still he pressed on, driven by sheer will. The knowledge he carried was too vital to lose. At last, he reached the relative safety of a dark alley collapsing against the wall as the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. The door to 221B Baker Street burst open, startling Watson from his chair. He rose in alarm as Holmes staggered inside, his hand pressed to his bloodied side. "Good heavens, Holmes!" Watson exclaimed, rushing to his friend's aid. He guided Holmes to the settee, quickly fetching his medical bag. "Spare the dramatics, Watson," Holmes muttered, though his voice lacked its usual vigor. "I've been in worse scrapes." Watson worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning and dressing the wound. "You're fortunate it wasn't fatal," he said grimly. "What on earth happened?" Holmes's gaze sharpened despite his exhaustion. "The Red Thorn. Their plans are worse than I imagined. They mean to destabilize the very foundations of Britain." Watson's hands stilled momentarily. "You've confirmed their existence, then?" "Beyond a doubt," Holmes replied, "and there is more. Connections that lead to darker places still." Watson settled into his chair, his brow furrowed as Holmes recounted the night's events. Yet there was a pause, a hesitation that was uncharacteristic of his friend. "Holmes," Watson said softly, "what aren't you telling me?" Holmes's gaze grew distant, his voice quieter. "The methods, the ruthlessness, it all carries the fingerprints of Moriarty's network. But there is a more personal thread woven into this case." Watson leaned forward, his concern deepening. "What do you mean?" Holmes closed his eyes briefly, his voice heavy with an unspoken burden. "This conspiracy. It stirs memories of Irene Adler. Her death, Watson. The shadows of that loss linger here." The silence that followed was palpable, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Watson finally spoke, his tone resolute. "Then we shall see this through, Holmes." For her, Holmes met Watson's gaze, a flicker of gratitude in his otherwise weary eyes. "Yes," he said simply. "For her." The dim glow of a solitary lantern illuminated Holmes's face as he adjusted the coarse scarf around his neck. His disguise was impeccable. A worn coat, a battered hat, and a demeanor that exuded menace. He had assumed the identity of a courier within the Red Thorn's ranks, his sharp mind piecing together the necessary details from previous encounters. "Watson," Holmes began, his voice low and deliberate, "I must caution you once more. This path is fraught with peril, and one misstep could unravel everything." Watson crossed his arms, his expression resolute. "You know full well that I will not abandon you in this endeavor. Say what you will, Holmes, but I am coming." Holmes allowed a faint smirk, the only acknowledgement of Watson's loyalty. "Very well," he said, producing a forged pass. "Let us proceed. The game is afoot, and our adversaries are unlikely to play fair." The clatter of carriage wheels echoed along the cobbled road as they journeyed toward the manor. Holmes sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the fog-shrouded horizon, while Watson studied his friend's profile, noting the tension in his jaw. "Holmes," Watson said, breaking the silence, I know you would rather face this alone, but you underestimate the strength of companionship. There is no shame in sharing the burden." Holmes sighed, a rare sign of concession. "Your loyalty, Watson, is both my greatest asset and my deepest concern. I trust you to watch my back, though it may cost us dearly." Watson's response was immediate. "Whatever the cost, Holmes, we face it together." The manor loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the moonlit sky. Ivy clung to its crumbling walls, and the air carried the faint scent of damp decay. Holmes and Watson approached with caution, their footsteps muffled against the overgrown path. "This place," Watson murmured, "reeks of secrets best left undiscovered." Holmes held up a hand for silence, his ears attuned to every creak and groan of the building. They entered through a side door, its rusted hinges protesting softly. Inside, the air was thick with dust and disuse. "Observe, Watson," Holmes whispered, pointing to a faint trail of footprints in the grime. "We are not alone. Someone has been here recently, and perhaps still is." The two men moved deeper into the manor, their every step fraught with tension. In what appeared to have once been a study, Holmes's keen eye was drawn to a bookshelf slightly ajar. He motioned for Watson to assist, and together they revealed a hidden compartment behind it. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked with age. Holmes opened it carefully, his expression darkening as he scanned the contents. "Watson, this is damning evidence indeed," he said, tapping a page. "A comprehensive list of individuals, politicians, businessmen, even members of law enforcement, compromised by the Red Thorn." Watson peered over his shoulder. "And these names in red ink?" "High-profile targets," Holmes replied grimly. "Victims yet to fall. This ledger is a roadmap to chaos, and it must not remain in their hands." Holmes secured the ledger beneath his coat, his movements brisk. "Come, Watson. We must—" His sentence was cut short by the sound of approaching footsteps. The shadows seemed to come alive as figures emerged, their faces obscured and their weapons glinting faintly in the dim light. Holmes pushed Watson behind him, his voice sharp. "Stay close and follow my lead." The first assailant lunged, but Holmes anticipated the move, sidestepping deftly and striking with his cane. Watson, though less agile, defended himself with determination, fending off an attacker with a chair leg. The room erupted into chaos, the sound of struggle reverberating through the decrepit manor. Holmes fought with precision, each movement calculated, but the odds were against them. A blow from behind sent Watson sprawling, his shoulders striking the ground with a sickening thud. He gritted his teeth against the pain, clutching his arm as Holmes dragged him to his feet. "Watson, we must retreat," Holmes barked, his tone brooking no argument. With the ledger clutched tightly, they stumbled through the maze-like corridors, the shouts of their pursuers growing fainter as they finally burst into the open air. Holmes helped Watson into the waiting carriage, his expression grim as he pressed a handkerchief to the wound on Watson's shoulder. "You've done well, my friend," he said quietly, though his voice carried the weight of their narrow escape. "But this is far from over." Holmes paced the confines of 221B Baker Street, the familiar scent of tobacco lingering in the air. The ledger lay open on the table, its damning contents scrutinized under the detective's relentless gaze. Watson observed silently, the intensity of Holmes's focus signaling that he was on the verge of a revelation. Suddenly, Holmes halted, his eyes gleaming with realization. "Sebastian Marlowe," he declared. Watson frowned. "The name is familiar. Wasn't he—" "A former ally," Holmes interrupted, his tone sharp. "A brilliant strategist in his own right, though prone to fits of moral ambiguity. We parted ways years ago after a disagreement over methods. It appears he has resurfaced, and with a vendetta." Watson leaned forward, his concern evident. "You believe he orchestrated all this?" "There is no doubt," Holmes replied, his voice heavy with conviction. The meticulous planning, the psychological precision, it bears his signature. Marlowe's mind was always a maze of cunning. This is personal, Watson. He intends to dismantle me as much as the nation. The dimly lit warehouse echoed with Holmes's footsteps as he approached the solitary figure standing amidst crates and shadows. Marlowe turned, his face illuminated by a faint, sardonic smile. "Ah, Holmes," Marlowe drawled, his voice smooth and mocking. "I wondered how long it would take for you to find me." Holmes remained composed, his keen eyes locked onto Marlowe. "Your games have gone far enough, Marlowe. Whatever grievance you hold against me does not justify this carnage." Marlowe chuckled darkly. "You always did moralize so eloquently. But this isn't about justification, Holmes. It's about demonstrating superiority, something you've long denied me." Holmes's voice was steady, though a trace of steel laced his words. "Superiority lies in preservation, not destruction. Your actions will collapse under their own weight." "Then let us see who collapses first," Marlowe replied, his smile vanishing as their battle of intellect began in earnest. Marlowe circled Holmes like a predator savoring its prey, his words sharp and deliberate. "You see, Holmes, this isn't merely about destabilizing the government. No, that is but a stepping stone. The true prize lies in breaking you." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And what would you gain from such a hollow victory?" Marlowe's expression darkened. "You cost me everything. My career, my reputation, my purpose. While you thrived, I was left to rot, haunted by the wreckage of my life. And now I shall return the favor, piece by piece." Holmes stood still, absorbing the venom in Marlowe's words. "Revenge blinds even the sharpest minds, Marlowe. You've let it consume you entirely." "Perhaps," Marlowe admitted, his tone icy. "But at least I'll have the satisfaction of seeing you crumble. That, Holmes, will be worth every sacrifice." Marlowe's voice softened, adopting a sinister intimacy. "Tell me, Holmes, do you ever dream of Irene Adler? Her wit, her beauty, and the fact that you failed her?" Holmes stiffened, the mention of her name striking a chord he rarely allowed to surface. Marlowe smiled coldly. "Ah, I see, I've hit a nerve. You couldn't save her, could you? For all your brilliance, all your deductions, you were powerless to stop her demise, and now you shall feel that powerlessness again." "You presume too much," Holmes said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Do I?" Marlowe replied. "Look at you, chasing shadows, doubting your own steps. This is only the beginning, Holmes. I will dismantle the myth of Sherlock Holmes until there's nothing left but a broken man." The tension between them was palpable, the silence punctuated by the faint creaks of the building settling around them. Holmes's mind raced, calculating his next move, yet Marlowe's relentless words lingered. "You falter, Holmes," Marlowe taunted. "Even your formidable mind cannot shield you from doubt." Holmes took a deliberate step forward, his voice regaining its edge. "You mistake hesitation for defeat. You are clever, Marlowe, but arrogance is your Achilles' heel. It blinds you to the inevitability of your failure." Marlowe's smile faltered for the first time, his composure slipping. "Bold words, Holmes, but words will not save you from the storm I've unleashed." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Perhaps not, but they may be enough to expose the cracks in your grand design. You've underestimated the resilience of those who stand against you." The two men locked eyes, the unspoken weight of their shared history and opposing convictions hanging heavy in the air. The battle between them was far from over, but Holmes had glimpsed the cracks in Marlowe's armor, and he intended to exploit them. Holmes awoke to the sensation of cold metal against his wrists, his hands bound tightly behind him. The dim murmur of voices sharpened into clarity as Marlowe's unmistakable tone pierced the darkness. "Ah, you're awake," Marlowe said, his voice a blend of triumph and venom. "The great Sherlock Holmes, brought low. How does it feel?" Holmes forced himself upright, his eyes meeting Marlowe's without flinching. "You've gone to great lengths, Marlowe. I take it this isn't merely professional." Marlowe smirked, gesturing toward the adjoining room, where Watson lay unconscious and restrained. "You see, Holmes, it's quite simple. You've a choice to make. Abandon your pursuit of the red thorn, or doctor. Watson pays the price for your stubbornness." Holmes's expression hardened. "Your games will not sway me. Justice cannot be traded for sentiment." "Then perhaps," Marlowe countered, "you should consider the weight of failure when his blood stains your hands." His tone was chilling, yet laced with anticipation, as though savoring Holmes's inner conflict. Alone in the flickering light, Holmes felt the walls of his resolve tighten. Marlowe's words echoed in his mind, a cruel reminder of the stakes. He turned his attention to Watson, who was beginning to stir, his face pale and lined with weariness. The sight filled Holmes with an ache he rarely allowed himself to feel. "This is my doing," Holmes murmured to himself. "I led us here, Watson, and now your life hangs in the balance." Watson's voice, weak but steady, broke through the silence. "Holmes, whatever you're thinking, don't. You've always known the cost of this path." Holmes met Watson's gaze, his own fraught with torment. "But what if that cost is you, old friend?" "Then it is one I willingly pay," Watson replied, his tone resolute despite the pain. The sudden crack of shattering glass tore through the tense quiet, and a surge of chaos erupted as Scotland Yard operatives stormed the hideout. Shouts and gunfire filled the air as Marlowe's men scrambled to defend their position. Holmes seized the distraction, wrenching himself free from his bindings with a deft maneuver he had prepared earlier. "Watson," he called, cutting through the noise as he reached his friend. Watson, though weakened, managed a nod of acknowledgement. "A dramatic entrance," he murmured, "but well-timed." Together they navigated the fray, dodging stray bullets and narrowly avoiding capture. Holmes's mind worked at lightning speed, cataloging each movement, each vulnerability in their adversaries' defenses. Marlowe stood at the center of the chaos, his composure shaken but unyielding. He locked eyes with Holmes, a silent challenge passing between them. Before Holmes could intercept him, Marlowe hurled a smoke bomb into the fray, vanishing in the ensuing cloud. By the time the air cleared, he was gone, leaving Holmes and Watson to contend with the aftermath. As the din subsided, Holmes stood amidst the wreckage, his expression grim. Scotland Yard officers secured the remaining operatives, but the absence of Marlowe cast a shadow over the operation. Watson, his arm in a makeshift sling, approached cautiously. "He escaped, didn't he?" Holmes nodded, his jaw tight. "Marlowe is a master of evasion. He planned for every eventuality." Lestrade approached, his face lined with concern. "We've secured the ledger and apprehended a fair number of his men. That's a victory, isn't it?" "Victory?" Holmes replied, his tone biting. "This is no victory, Inspector. Marlowe remains at large, his plans still in motion. This is merely survival." Watson placed a steadying hand on Holmes's shoulder. "We'll stop him, Holmes. This isn't over." Holmes's gaze lingered on the horizon, his mind already turning toward the next move. "No, Watson, it isn't over. Not by a long stretch." Later that night, Holmes sat in silence at the window of 221B Baker Street, the faint glow of the city casting long shadows across the room. Watson observed from his chair, sensing the turmoil within his friend. "Holmes," Watson said softly, "you can't carry this weight alone." Holmes didn't look at him, his voice distant. "Marlowe's words were not without merit. My failures have left cracks in the foundation. Irene Adler, now you." He trailed off, his usual poise faltering. Watson leaned forward, his tone firm. "Failures do not define a man, Holmes. What matters is how he rises in their wake." Holmes turned to face Watson, a flicker of gratitude softening his features. "You, Watson, are the anchor that keeps me from drifting. Perhaps that will be enough." With that, the room fell into a quiet stillness, the unspoken weight of the battle ahead lingering like a specter in the air. The air within 221B Baker Street was heavy with an unnatural stillness. Holmes sat in his chair, the once vivid spark in his eyes dimmed to embers. His violin rested untouched beside him, and the case papers lay scattered across the floor, as though abandoned mid-thought. Watson entered quietly, his gaze falling on his friend's slumped figure. Holmes had barely spoken since their return, retreating into himself in a way that unnerved even Watson, who was no stranger to his moods. "Holmes," Watson began gently, "you must not let this consume you. One man cannot bear the weight of every failure." Holmes stirred but did not lift his gaze. "Failure, Watson, is not merely a fleeting shadow. It is a scar, a reminder of the fallibility I cannot afford. Marlowe is still at large, and his plans remain intact. I have failed to see the end of his web." Watson stepped closer, his voice firm yet compassionate. "You may falter, Holmes, but you have not fallen. There is still time to set this right." Holmes sighed, his fingers gripping the armrest of his chair. "Time, Watson, is the cruelest currency of all, and I fear I am bankrupt." That evening, Watson found himself alone in the study, gazing at the remnants of the case that had nearly broken them both. The ledger sat on the table, its contents damning and incomplete. Nearby, Holmes's pipe rested cold and unused. Watson's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the toll this ordeal had taken on his friend. Holmes, the man who could outwit the sharpest minds and unravel the most intricate puzzles, was now weighed down by a burden that seemed insurmountable. He recalled the moments of brilliance Holmes had displayed, even in the direst of circumstances. Yet, for all his genius, he was still human, flawed, vulnerable, and haunted by the cost of his pursuits. "I won't let him sink further," Watson murmured to himself. "He has carried us through the darkest of storms. Now it is my turn to be his anchor." The resolve in Watson's heart solidified. Holmes might see himself as a shadow of greatness, but Watson would remind him of the light he could still cast. The knock at the door was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Watson answered, finding no one in sight. Instead, a single envelope lay on the threshold, its edges lined with crimson ink. He carried it inside, his unease growing as he placed it on the table. Holmes, though sluggish, rose from his chair at the sight of it. "Open it," he instructed, his voice low. Inside was a single sheet, the handwriting precise and deliberate. "To my dear Holmes, you play the game well, but I fear the final move shall be mine. Until then, relish the silence." Marlowe Watson's grip on the note tightened. "The audacity," he muttered. "He dares to taunt you even now." Holmes's expression was unreadable, though a flicker of something, determination perhaps, passed through his eyes. "Marlowe is a predator, Watson, and predators thrive on the chase. This is not over, nor will it be, until one of us falters." Watson watched as Holmes straightened, the note still in hand. Though his movements were slow and deliberate, there was a hint of the man Watson knew. The brilliance, the resolve, the unyielding determination. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice steady, "you have faced greater adversaries than Marlowe. You have defied the odds time and again. This is no different." Holmes glanced at him, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Ever the optimist, Watson. Were I a lesser man, I would envy your faith." "And were I a lesser man," Watson replied, "I would question your capacity for resilience. But I know better." For the first time in days, Holmes allowed himself a genuine moment of reflection. "Then we shall see it through, my friend. Not for glory, nor vengeance, but for the balance that must be restored." As Watson extinguished the lamp that night, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was far from over, but he knew that together they would weather whatever storm lay ahead.